My name is Becky Schneider, and I'm a reference librarian at the Library of Virginia. And today's workshop is going to be about using AI, such as ChatGPT, in history research. So usually I would start by talking kind of just an overview of what we're going to be learning today. But I did want to quickly discuss why I decided to offer this workshop. So as I'm going to be discussing, my training is as a librarian. I'm not an expert in AI, machine learning. But about 6 months after ChatGPT became commercially available, so about a year ago, I got my first reference question relating to ChatGPT. A coworker of mine was helping a researcher find a journal article, and neither of them could find this journal article. They looked everywhere. It was just nowhere to be found. So I went ahead and I looked for the article myself. And it was by a author who wrote a lot of legal history. The journal it was published in, I could find that journal. I could find the issue that it was supposed to appear in. There was no such article in that issue. And so I went ahead and I asked, can I see the source for this mysterious journal article? And I read it through, and there was just something about the way that it was written that was a little bit off. It was a little bit stilted. And I noticed that none of the sources at the bottom of the article were real sources, including this article that I couldn't find. And I realized that this was my first question that related to ChatGPT, that I was pretty sure a large language model like ChatGPT had written this article and hallucinated these sources. And it was a novelty to have this happen for the first time in my career, but it also made me realize that the strategies that I usually use to answer people's questions, they usually rely on the idea that if I run into a problem, it's some type of human error. Someone made a typo, made a mistake, a record was missing, or a record had wrong information. But the skills I needed to recognize that an AI had made a mistake felt a little bit different. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking just a really high-level overview of how these large language models, such as ChatGPT, work, and some of the skills we need to use them if we are doing research. So I'm going to be giving this overview and using some of the information we learned to talk about how to figure out whether a large language model, or LLM, is a good fit for your research task. I'm going to be talking about how to recognize these texts that were authored by AI when you encounter them in the wild, whether you're online, someone emails something to you, you're on social media, how to sort of think about the fact that we're going to be encountering information that was not written by a human. And then I'm going to finish with some perspectives on the impact of large language models and AI. And I'm not going to try to be really prescriptive and tell you, like, here's how I feel about large language models, here's how you should feel. But I'm gonna just talk about some of the big questions people are asking about how this is going to change the way that we find information, the way that we do research, and the way that we think about information, especially online. So I'm going to be starting with a really high-level overview again of how large language models work. And I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not a machine learning expert, so I'm going to be doing some simplifying, but I'm going to be discussing some of the jargon we encounter and some of especially the training that goes on to make these models do what they do. And I think that's going to help inform when I discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of these tools. So I'm going to start by discussing some terms. So I'm going to be using throughout this presentation the phrase large language model. You'll also see that as LLM, and that is the underlying technology that powers any efficient language-based AI such as ChatGPT. So large language models, they can be defined as a type of artificial neural network that is used to power generative AI. And a lot of these terms we might not be super familiar with, so I'm going to define them. So an artificial neural network, or a neural network, is something you're going to see if you start reading up on AI. And I think it's kind of like a very high-tech term. It might be a little bit intimidating, but what it means is that the programmers who created this software were inspired by biological nervous systems, like in you and me, in your cat, in your dog, all of those synapses and neurons that allow us to think and interact with the world. There is a similar structure in a large language model where there's lots of little interconnected pieces. Those little interconnected pieces, as they complete tasks, they're able to adjust themselves. They're able to change the values in those equations. And because of that, they're able to get better over time. And that means they can do something called machine learning. Neural networks and large language models are not the only type of technology that can do machine learning. That's a pretty old discipline at this point, but they're really, really good at it, as we're going to be discussing. The important thing to keep in mind is just because it is modeled after a nervous system does not mean it is alive. It doesn't mean that it really thinks in any meaningful way. It doesn't have any self-awareness. It just has a similar structure. So I think a lot of people, especially when you start interacting with a tool like ChatGPT and it seems so human, it's really easy to start thinking of it as something that's kind of like us, but it's not like us in some really important ways that we're going to be discussing. And finally, you're going to also see the term generative AI, and that just means any machine or software that is able to create brand new original content. So if it's able to generate an image, audio, video, or text, it's generative AI. So that will include LLMs like ChatGPT, but it's not limited to those. There's lots of different types of generative AI. And that's kind of like the ooh-ah factor of these programs, that they can create really sophisticated content in a way that was not possible before. So we're going to really drill down into how ChatGPT works. And I chose this because it is still the most ubiquitous example of a large language model, and it was the first one that was available to the public. But there are many options if you are using LLMs, and they all work a little bit differently. And they're all also, because they're being run by different companies, they might not totally document some of their trade secrets. So there might be aspects to their training and their functioning that I'm not aware of because they're not public knowledge. But this software became available in 2017, or 2017 was when a paper was written that kind of proposed the underlying model that became the large language model. And then in 2018, a company called OpenAI produced the first version. And it took 4 more years for it to become a publicly available tool. And just a fun fact, what does GPT mean? It means generative pre-trained transformer. So it's generative because it's producing new content. Pre-trained is the type of training it's able to do to become better and do that machine learning. We're going to be talking about that. And transformer is the type of architecture that was proposed in that initial 2017 paper. So here is my best understanding of how it works. I'm not going to go into, again, some of the math behind it or the really heavy computer science, but here are the basics that we need to know. So it all starts when this program is provided with a massive set of data. So in order to model language, in order to be able to produce human-like sentences, it needs something to draw from. So it is exposed to a huge data set that is based on human language. So that might be conversations happening online. It might be books. All of that is put together and turned into something that a computer program can read. Based on that data set, the model is then asked to do this pre-training phase where the model becomes better. So for instance, the model might be asked to do some tasks like guessing the next word in an incomplete sentence. So the model has access to probably millions, billions of sentences, and it's given a sentence like, Paris is the capital of blank. And based on all of the data that's been put into it, it probably knows that it should finish that by saying Paris is the capital of France. As it keeps practicing, it is going to change its own programming, adjust all of those little values inside of it in order to become a more accurate model of English and other human languages. So not only is it sort of memorizing vocabulary, it's starting to model sentence structure, context, and really like the relationships between ideas that are represented in language. So it's not only able to generate a sentence that sounds believable and human, it's able to generate whole paragraphs where there's something of a flow of content and the different parts of the paragraphs seem like they fit together. So it's not just randomly changing topic. So that's called the pre-training stage, where it really like hashes out, okay, this is how language works. And it becomes able to see text and continue it. So that's why when you talk to it, when you're entering your questions into the chatbot, it sees your question and it's able to say, this is what I think the most plausible answer is, because it's just continuing the flow of the text, just like completing that incomplete sentence. But there's also a final training stage or a series of stages where human workers work with these. And this is where they're fine tuning it to not only produce believable language, but to make a program that actually achieves certain goals of the company that made this large language model. So for instance, they want to make sure that the answers it gives are helpful. It's not just giving you advice that has nothing to do with your question. They want to make sure that they're appropriate so that it's not using inappropriate language. It is not being offensive. It's not doing anything that would be really shocking, like telling you, hey, this is how you cheat on your taxes. They want these things to kind of stay in line and achieve certain goals. So examples of how they might do that is giving the LLM an example of good answers to questions. So it knows this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. Or asking the LLM to answer a question different ways and then saying this was a good answer and this was a bad answer. So you're basically, again, training it to not only generate language, but generate helpful and appropriate language. And we'll get into how effective and perfect this training is, but there always is this training phase at the end. Finally, once it's able to be trained, it becomes a commercially available program in many cases, where it can go back and forth with a person through a chatbot interface. And again, it's able to see what you type in and say, what's the most plausible answer? And it's able to therefore have a back and forth conversation where you can respond, you can say, hey, your answer was fine, but what if we make this change? And it's able to sort of remember the thread of a conversation because it's using everything that you typed in, it's adding that into its model and producing a plausible response. So again, ChatGPT is not the only large language model. There are several options. These are some of the most popular ones. And something to keep in mind is sometimes the company that produces the LLM and the LLM itself have slightly different names. So just know that, like, for instance, Meta, which is the company that runs Facebook and Instagram, they have an AI called Meta AI, and then the large language model that powers it has a different name altogether. It's Llama. So when you see these names, you might think, is Llama the same as Meta AI? And you just might need to look that up and confirm, hey, is this the same software or different? Just a year ago, we were mostly using these through standalone websites. So if I wanted to use ChatGPT, I would just go to the ChatGPT website, but now we're starting to see them integrated into search engines, integrated into social media applications like Facebook and Instagram, or even seeing them in cloud applications like Microsoft Office. All right, so that was your whirlwind tour into how this technology works. And let's talk about some observations people have made about what they seem to be good and bad at. And I think this is going to be like a little clearer now that we have talked through how they work. And so I did a little bit of experimentation as I was trying to like provide some recommendations of how you can use an LLM, but any one person experimenting is imperfect because one thing that is baked into these LLMs is that they have a little bit of creativity. So if they have several possible ways of finishing a sentence or answering a question, they're going to do it a little different each time. So that's why sometimes when you ask a question, you can get different answers at different times. So I'm just one person, I played around, but you might have different results, especially as the models continue to improve. So the thing that these do really well is modeling human language. And so a lot of people are using them for tasks that involve language. for writing the first draft of something, not necessarily the final draft, but if you just want to get a draft out there of something you want to write based on notes, you can do that. You can do revision of grammar, of tone, of spelling. You can translate. And something that's pretty cool about the fact that it has a chatbot interface is that unlike other tools that allow you to like correct your spelling, correct your grammar, or translate, it allows you to customize the results based on your input. So with something like Google Translate, you can translate between languages. And especially if you're working with history documents and there's a language you don't know, that's super useful. But with a large language model, you can say, I want to translate between these two languages, but I want to translate it for an academic audience. Or you can say, I want to translate it for a 5-year-old. And it's able to actually respond to that and customize what it's doing based on your prompt. So that's like pretty powerful. Another thing it's pretty good at that I found is summarizing information. So now some of them allow you to like upload a document and you can say, hey, here's a document. Can you summarize this into paragraphs? I would always do a spot check to see it, like, did it leave out important information? But it is able to like take a very long text and kind of shorten it for you. And that can be helpful if you're going through a lot of different sources. I didn't get to play around with its ability to do like data analysis as much. Some of those functions are a lot easier if you have a paid version of one of these LLMs, but it does have some ability to work with data, to work with spreadsheets. So if you're doing anything with sort of like quantitative data or organizing information, it does have some ability to do that. The advice is always, again, to spot check it to make sure it's not making errors. And we'll talk in the next slide about why it might make those errors. And then the thing I think it actually can be most powerful for is idea generation, brainstorming, and kind of the serendipity of running across new ideas. Because such a wide variety of content is put into the data set that teaches the LLM how to use language, it knows a lot of different stuff. And so if you're just looking for ideas about like how to learn about a new topic or where to look for a certain type of information, any type of open-ended question where there's not a right or wrong answer, you can always like ask the LLM for a second opinion. It can do like, here's a learning list for the next 6 months. If I want to learn a new topic, here are things that I could do to improve my skills. It's going to be really good at that type of open-ended brainstorming. Again, it might leave things out, it might not get everything perfect, but because it's not a factual question, instead it's just idea generation, it's pretty good at it. But let's talk about what it's not so good at. So the first limitation that's pretty obvious is these are very much reliant on that initial data set that they're trained on. So they don't know everything, and there's no source out there that knows everything. And specifically, some of them are using data sets that might be a couple months old. So if anything has happened in the last 2 months, they might not have access to that information. They're not going to have access to information that's not online at all. So, you know, there's a lot of historical sources that are still not digitized. They're not going to know about those. They're not going to know about perspectives that are not well represented on the internet. So if you are interested in the history of a minority group that doesn't use the internet as much, maybe it's because they use a language that isn't spoken by very many people, it's probably not going to be reflected very well in the LLM because that information was not uploaded into it. And then finally, it's going to reproduce social biases. This is a big concern people have about these tools, is because they are kind of representing the collective quote unquote wisdom of the internet. Any biases that are knocking around in our collective heads, it's going to probably leak out into the LLM. And because of that training phase, they're not necessarily going to be like really egregious about saying awful things, although sometimes that does happen. But there are really basic things that I think a lot of us have unconsciously in our minds that we might not agree with, but probably do seep out into our language. So for instance, a lot of us, if we imagine a doctor, we think of a man. If we imagine a nurse, we think of a woman. That's just part of our cultural meme of making those gender assumptions. And so something like that is going to sometimes show up in the content that a generative AI tool produces. In addition to those biases and those limitations, Because LLMs are language tools, they're not actually logical thinkers. I was actually just reading an article this morning talking about how when you ask them to do tasks that they haven't memorized, so it's not something where like they were able to just like say, okay, yes, that is in my data set. I can just like reproduce it. Anything that requires any logical thought, any analysis, that's not something that they're good at. So they will do things like make math errors if the math is too hard. But they also can't make good judgment calls. So they are good writers, especially compared to other AI. But the content they produce, you might not be super impressed with it depending on your goals. It tends to be a little bit bland, a little bit stilted, and sometimes the tone really misses the mark. I kind of describe it as a precocious eighth grader who's a really good writer, but doesn't really understand the content that they're writing about. There's just something a little bit off. So if you're a great writer, you might not be super impressed by the LLM. And then they just don't understand facts. And as I said at the beginning, they will sometimes hallucinate sources because they don't understand it's wrong to lie. I think that is something that's trying to be trained into them, but it's really difficult because that's not really how they're designed. They're just designed to produce things that sound good. An example of a factual error that I found when I used any LLM that I tried. So I asked them, how did people in colonial Virginia decorate for Christmas? And almost, I think actually every single one of them told me, oh, they decorate with fruit. There's a strong association between colonial Virginia and decorating with fruit. And that's because colonial Williamsburg decorates with fruit. But that is not an authentic colonial practice. Of course, people in the colonial era ate their fruit. They weren't going to waste it on decorations. But back in the 1930s, CW started decorating with fruit. And because of that, there's this really strong association on the internet between fruit and the colonial era. And so over and over, it told me this factual inaccuracy. And it's not that the right information isn't out there, but if there's a real predominant myth online, it's probably going to get baked into the LLM. And the LLM just doesn't know better. So with that all in mind, how do we make decisions about how to use these tools? Here are some questions you can ask yourself. Is this the right tool for the job? I think that's really important. Whenever we have an emerging technology, there's always a hype cycle where everybody gets really excited about all the things that the tool can do. And of course, the companies who are trying to sell people on these tools, they're gonna, brag about how impressive it is. And then the media is always looking for a new story. So there's always going to be a lot of breathless coverage of a new technology. Some of it's going to be like, this is changing the world, and some of it is going to be like, this is ruining the world. And it can be really difficult to evaluate those claims and think, hey, this is a new technology. It does do a lot of cool things, but how do I want to use it? Is it really appropriate for everything or just certain instances? So something to think about is that large language models and generative AI, they're not the only cool tools, technological tools that you can use for history research, family history research, whatever you're up to. If you search for the term digital humanities, that's a discipline where historians and other humanities academics are applying all sorts of technologies to their research, and there's a lot out there. Some of it does have more of a learning curve than LLMs because you might need to do a little bit of coding, you might need to have some data science knowledge, but some of it is actually really accessible. So I would say like become aware of other tools, and then you can kind of have more of a perspective of what LLMs can do and what other tools can do just as well. Something else to think about is there are multiple options for large language models these days, and they all have different features. So some of them now have the ability to upload images or upload documents. Some of them have some ability to surf the web. That does not seem like it's very good so far, at least from my experience, but it might get better over time that you can tell it, hey, here's a web address, tell me about it. Some of them could do more advanced data analysis. Some of them can remember conversations better or really like hold context. So if you are interacting with it over a period of time, it will start to get to know how to give you answers that are useful for you. And finally, some of them do have the ability to be customized. So with ChatGPT, there are a lot of custom versions that you can now access. And so just like become aware of what the different options are, what new features are. Usually there's some type of documentation associated with these programs that you can read through and see what they're able to do, and it's going to differ. And then if you're using a free version, know that there are paid versions of all of these tools that have different features and more features. And depending on like how excited you are about incorporating them into your research, maybe you decide, hey, like I do want to throw money at this because the free version isn't doing what I need. Just be aware that you have those options. And then finally, one of the most powerful things about these tools is that you don't have to be a coder, you don't have to be a programmer. You can just use your own natural language to talk to them and ask it questions. But there are skills required to be able to write a good prompt, to put input in there that's going to get a good answer. You're going to see a lot online about prompt engineering. And I think for the average person, a lot of the tips, it's just really hard to prove if they work because these will answer differently at different moments and they're changing continuously. I don't think there are like magic words that you can put into a large language model to get the perfect response. But do remember that the LLM does not know anything that you don't tell it. So provide as much context as you can when you're asking a question. You can tell it, hey, like, this is why I need this information. These are my goals. And it's able to see the keywords in that part of your question and craft its response. You can also ask it to do something in step-by-step instructions and kind of think like, if I had a student assistant or an intern, how would I teach them? A lot of that sort of like scaffolding of breaking things up into steps and reminding the LLM, hey, don't forget to check X, Y, or Z, that can actually produce better responses as well. And then a really good one is to actually provide it with examples of the output you want. So let's say that you're doing a project that requires a lot of writing. You could do one example that you wrote yourself. You could give that to the LLM and say, hey, I want more examples that are just like this. By giving it an example, you're going to get much closer to what you want. Otherwise, it might just, it's going to fill in the blanks of anything you don't tell it. And it might produce something that is really far afield from what you were imagining. But of course, because you can go back and forth with it and you can ask it, hey, I didn't like that last response. Let's try this again with this information. You can really also have this iterative process where if the first prompt doesn't work, you can tweak it. So that's something to keep in mind. So I did want to, talk also not just about how we're using LLMs, but what we're doing when we are encountering texts that were created by AI, which is going to probably happen more and more over the next few years. So here's some suggestions of trying to figure out, hey, did an AI write what I'm reading? And it's going to be tough. So I described my encounter a year ago where I was able to read something and say, yeah, I think an AI wrote this. It might change over time, especially as these become more powerful. But I do think that there are some, at least right now, there are some rules of thumb that you can keep in mind. So the first thing, and again, this is based on how LLMs are writing right now in 2024. I feel like you can kind of ask, does it pass the sniff test? Does it feel like it could be an AI? And interacting with these and practicing with them, you're going to get a sense of what the text they produce looks like. But as I said before, it does tend to be a little bit bland. Sometimes it's a little bit stilted or overblown. Like I feel like often they're a little bit more excited than I would be if I was writing about whatever topic. They tend to use almost like marketing language a little bit. And sometimes there's just like a mismatch between the language that it's using and the actual content. More than that, I find that the texts that are produced by AIs, they just do lack that logic or deep analysis. So you'll find that it will subtly change topic halfway through a paragraph, or that the paragraphs, when you first read through them, they seem connected, but when you really think about it, you see, oh, there's really no like logical connection between all of these ideas. The transitions feel natural, but the ideas just are disjointed. And again, it's possible a person could write that way, but right now there is just like a very specific tone that AIs tend to use. But more than that, I think we can actually go back to our traditional best practices when we encounter a source and we're not quite sure who wrote it, where it's from, whether to trust it. There are best practices you can follow no matter whether it's AI or just an author that is not very like authoritative. So if I encounter something, whether it's like through a search engine, through social media, someone sent me something, I can first ask, hey, do I know who wrote this? And is that person or publisher credible? Something to keep in mind is there might be some companies out there that have traditionally had really good reputations. But now their websites are more like content farms. So I'm not going to name any names, but like a lot of the companies that were publishing magazines 20 years ago, now when you go to their websites, they just have a lot of like clickbaity articles that are not very deep. It's possible that some of those websites are going to start using AI because they're basically just in it for the ad revenue. So see, what is this company doing now or this publisher doing now in 2024? Are they publishing good stuff? Does this author seem like they have any credibility? Like, are they a historian, a journalist? What's their background? If you cannot figure out who this person is, then you can also look at the text itself. So like, are they citing sources? Are those sources real or hallucinated? Does it seem like someone did their homework? And then finally, if you're looking at something and you're still not sure, you can do something called lateral searching, which is where you find a fact and you want to know it's true. Try to find a second or a third place where it's also sourced, or if it's historical, try to trace it back to the original primary source. So if you are comfortable doing history research, even if you're not super comfortable knowing, hey, did an AI write this? You can still do the same fact checking that you've always been doing in order to say, hey, is this really true? The last thing I'll note in this section is that you will probably have seen or come across the idea that there are like AI detectors. So there are like websites where you can paste something and the website tries to tell you, hey, is this AI or is this human? They're not perfect. They are sometimes accurate. And there are actually some that are specifically designed for teachers that are a little more accurate, but you do have to pay for them. So you can certainly try to use an AI detection website to double check, hey, did an AI write this? But just know it's just not going to be perfect. But again, I think if we just use our traditional best practices of information literacy, it's going to take an extra time. And that's kind of a concern for people is if we have to sort through all of these different sources and we just don't know, are they good? Are they bad? Are they junk? It's going to be time consuming. So if it's really important to you, just know you might have to spend the extra time to verify it. And finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about some of the ethics and social impact of using AI. And again, I'm not trying to give anyone any concrete answers, especially as this is continuing to evolve, as these technologies evolve. But I did want to talk about some of the questions people are raising, some of which you might have seen in news stories, you might have brought up when you're having conversations with people about how this technology might change the way that we interact with each other, with information, and the experiences we have when we're doing research. So the very practical thing I wanted to start with is the question of security and privacy when we are using AI. So whenever you are putting questions into a chatbot like a ChatGPT, and then any answers you get, Those are usually permanently stored in the service. So if you've used these, you'll notice that all the questions you've asked are usually like they're in the left-hand menu and you can go back to them. So the question is, what happens to all of that data? One question to ask about the service that you're using is, are your questions, your inputs and the outputs, so those are the answers, are those being used to train the large language model? In almost all cases, they are. So if you look at the privacy policy associated with the LLM, it will explain what it does with your data and to what extent that data is anonymized when it's used for training. Now, you might not care about this. You might be delighted to help make these better. But if you're doing anything that's sensitive, like with personal information, maybe you're doing family history and putting in things about living people, maybe it's just a topic that if someone else was like looking over your shoulder at your questions, you would feel really uncomfortable. Maybe you're not comfortable with that. So in that case, see if there's a service that has a privacy policy you're more comfortable with, or if there are options to opt out of having your data get fed back into the training. Another question is whether data from other services offered by that same company are used to train the LLM. So again, that should be in any privacy policies associated with the company. But some companies that started in one tech arena are now branching out into AI. And so whatever services they were already offered, in some cases, like let's say that they are already running a social media platform, all of that might be fed into the LLM. And then again, it's just the question of like, okay, how comfortable am I with that? And how anonymous is it? Are the trainers and the computer engineers seeing just my content, or is it being anonymized so that the content is not something that people can just kind of peek at and see everything that I've been doing? And then even if you feel super comfortable with the privacy policies of these companies, you should ask, hey, would I be really upset if my account got hacked? Because all of this is being stored in the cloud. And as anyone who has any online accounts knows, it's going to probably get hacked at some point, or at least there's a strong risk. So there can be measures that you can take to get around this. Some of these companies are insisting that people use two-factor authentication, where any codes get sent to an email or a text before you log in so that it knows that you're definitely the person logging in. But of course, nothing is foolproof. So just be thoughtful about what you are putting into these services and your level of comfort. And, especially if you're working with other people, do you have other people's data that you're putting in there? And how would they feel about that? Just some really big questions to ask. And especially for folks who are like doing this as part of their jobs, your company or your organization, they might need to have their own policy about how this is used. But then from there, we're going to get into some of the even heavier questions. So the first thing I wanted to talk about are some of the labor questions associated with large language models, and especially from the perspective of intellectual property. There's some really big questions about this technology. And these are questions that we have to ask about pretty much any type of information technology, whether we are talking about traditional publishing, search engines, any technology. It's going to require either paid or volunteer labor to create it. And if you are part of that ecosystem, whether you are creating texts you're publishing yourself, or whether you are a user, a librarian, a historian, you're going to be interacting with these systems, and it might affect you in some way, or you might just be concerned about it. So when we think about the people who are creating AI, we often think about computer scientists who are, probably pretty well compensated and hopefully really enjoy their jobs because they're working on a really cool type of technology. But there are also other types of workers who are contributing to large language models. Specifically, something I've read about is that final training phase where we kind of tweak the LLM to make it be appropriate and helpful. Some of that work is being done by contractors. So I read one story about a contracting firm in Kenya. The workers were not well paid, but the firm, I think, was trying to give interesting jobs to people that would really expand their skill set. However, the firm actually ended up severing the contract early. And it's because in order to train an LLM, you actually have to do some pretty upsetting work where you make sure it doesn't say horrible things. You have to make sure that it's not going to give really inappropriate or illegal responses. So the folks doing these jobs were having to read through just really awful texts that were being generated by the AI in order to stop the AI from exhibiting that behavior. And they just were not getting compensated for that type of work. They were not getting the mental health support to do that type of work. So that's unfortunately work that is very much baked into any technology these days, whether it's an AI that's being inappropriate or people are inappropriate online a lot and people have to moderate that content. But that is something that is necessary right now in order to produce this technology. And so there's a lot of conversation about making sure that those people are being taken care of. And so that's just something to keep aware of if that's something that would concern you about using the technology. And then for those of us who are interested in intellectual property and who maybe are publishing ourselves, there's absolutely a question of copyright. So we know that pretty much all of the commercially available large language models were trained with copyrighted material by authors who did not consent and did not get compensation. And that's because these are huge data sets. So far, the only way that people have figured out to affordably create these tools is to scrape the internet and just like pull content off of websites where it's just, up for anyone to look at. And in some cases, they've also scraped self-published books by authors who absolutely, wanted copyright control over their materials. So all of the content that I just described, it should have copyright protections. So that's a legal conversation happening right now about, do companies that use these materials to train their LLMs, do they have like obligations to the people whose content they're using? And is there a way to create a LLM or a similar technology without just reusing copyrighted materials? So nobody has answers to this yet. And there's this push and pull between the legal and the ethical questions and the fact that this is really powerful and interesting technology that I think a lot of folks do want to continue to develop. So that's kind of a developing question. Bigger than even that, and this is where I start to think as a librarian, how is this going to affect me? How is this going to change our larger information ecosystem? So there are kind of two big things that I think about. A lot of folks are concerned that because AI is becoming so available, certain types of labor, it just might not be as competitive if a human is doing it. So, this has happened countless times when computer illustration and clip art became really popular. Traditional illustration became less of a job that people could really make a living at. So now if you're like a copywriter, a translator, you might still think that your skills are better than what a large language model can offer. But some companies are going to think, yeah, but the large language model is good enough. So there are a lot of good enough jobs that AI can do that might cause other types of jobs to be devalued. And that just might change the way that publishing works. It might create incentives for more and more of these tasks to be done by AI. And it could have impacts on the rest of us. So, maybe you don't want the books that you're reading and the content that you're reading to be just good enough. Maybe you want it to be really professional, but it could be that some companies are going to have incentives to cut corners and you start coming across texts that are not really copy read as well as you would like. The translations are a little sloppy. I have no idea whether this is going to happen and to what extent, but it's definitely already affecting companies' choices about where they allocate their resources. And then in addition, there are questions of online content in general and how AI is going to reshape this. So this is especially true with search engines incorporating AI features into their search results pages. If over the last 10 to 20 years, a lot of online content has been paid for with ads. So when I go to a website, it can have great content, but I'm not paying for it. It's being paid for by having ads in there. So the ad revenue is able to pay the publisher. If we have AI giving us really great answers on the homepage of Google, it means people are not clicking through to the websites that really produce that content in the first place. So if you just spend all of your time looking at AI and not looking at individual websites, those individual websites might have to turn the lights off and fold. And this is, again, going to happen every time we have some type of like information revolution. The way that newspapers have given away way to online news, the way that print magazines really are not a going concern the way that they used to. But in this case, it actually might also pose issues for AI itself. So if you have fewer websites producing content because there are fewer clicks, the AI is being trained on those websites, and you can actually run into something that people are calling the curse of recursion. And that means that if AI doesn't have as much data to go into it, the AI is just going to end up learning from other AI. So you're just going to have ChatGPT reading other things produced by ChatGPT to learn how to use English language or human language. And this can cause the models to become worse and worse and worse because there's just not enough data being fed into them. So nobody knows for sure that this is going to happen. I don't think we have a sense yet of how this is going to affect online publishing, but there is a concern for a lot of us who rely on a lot of really wonderful websites that if we're just using a few products that are churning out text from AI, all of the human publishers who need to keep creating content for us to be able to learn and share information, they really might struggle. So that's just a question that, again, people are trying to figure out what is this going to look like and how can both of these types of information, AI and human generated information, how can we all kind of live peaceably? And then finally, you've probably seen a lot of discussion of the energy impacts of AI. Because these are such a new technology with a huge footprint, they are changing our need for like data centers. They just need more energy than like using a traditional website. It's a huge footprint to be able to ask ChatGPT a question and get an answer. So the companies, I think, are also concerned about it. Users are concerned about this. People are trying to figure out at a time when a lot of people are concerned about everyone using less energy, what type of infrastructure are we going to need? And are we prepared to expand our infrastructure if generative AI and other types of machine learning continue to become a bigger part of our economy? So that's not a question that you or I is going to solve, but it is something to think about depending on the type of work you do and your values in doing that work. It might be something that you're concerned about and want to keep in mind, want to keep reading the news and see how it evolves. So finally, I just wanted to kind of sum up what I think, we can kind of all hold in our minds right now as this technology is still incredibly new, to kind of imagine like what is the world that we want and what is the sort of information ecosystem that we want to be working in. So I think the really powerful thing about large language models is that they do expand access. They can potentially expand access to information. You don't have to be an expert searcher in order to ask ChatGPT a question. You don't have to have all the same skills. So if you don't have data science skills, if you're not great at grammar, if you don't speak multiple languages, this is a tool that can actually like enhance your existing skills potentially. Again, there are still some limitations to it. But I think people are really excited about the idea that something that right now can be really hard, like doing things with data, like understanding difficult text, like, decoding jargon, you can have an assistant that can really help you with that stuff. But the biggest question that I think people who are interested in information and research are asking is if we become part of a world where these technologies are really ubiquitous, what does it mean to talk about authority of information when there are no authors? When I interact with something like ChatGPT, it's kind of drawing on the collective wisdom of the internet. And so it's not one person who I can fact check or ask questions about their motivations, their biases. Instead, all of our biases, all of our different motivations are all being baked into one voice. And that's just like hard to wrap our heads around. And I think, we're just going to have to keep up and remember that this tool is not representing any one perspective. It's just like a lot of different authors that are all being blended together. And it just makes us really think about information literacy differently. In terms of the final product, US courts have kind of fallen on the side that you can't copyright anything that comes out of a large language model. So again, if we are going to use these texts, who is the author? If we are, using them to kind of tweak what we're doing or enhance what we're doing, it becomes a collaboration with a author that is not a person. And that becomes a weird legal question. It becomes a weird, like, professional best practices question. But I am comforted by the fact, as I've said several times, this is not the first time we've been through a big information revolution. The rise of the internet and smartphones was one of those revolutions, but you can see the same panic over the rise of the printing press, and there was even the same panic over the rise of writing itself. So it's not the first time we have kind of navigated these really difficult information literacy questions and these really difficult just ethical questions about, like, how do we want to communicate and how do we interact with information. So my best suggestion is just like keep in touch with your learning communities, whether that's the libraries and archives you work with, the other learners and researchers you work with, all the other people who are curious about these topics. I think as we continue to learn and kind of continue to just watch where things go, because they're going to continue to change, we'll have a better sense of what this is going to look like and kind of where our comfort level falls. So, you might feel one way about using this technology right now, and that might evolve in a year or 2 years. And I'm just going to be learning myself as this continues to change. It does look like I was able to give us a few minutes for questions. So again, I'm going to kind of read through the chat for the next few minutes, but anything that you were curious about, especially if you're able to like leave your email address, I can reach out, but then I have my email address right here. And if you have any questions, anything that I didn't cover, and again, this is such a vast topic, I'm sure that there's things that I missed or nuances that you might want to discuss. Feel free to reach out to me. So I'm gonna just, again, I'm probably gonna go, let me go to the top and see if I can answer a few questions. Let me see. All right. Can the hallucinations be removed from ChatGPT? You can try to tell ChatGPT, please, like, don't do that. Like, for instance, you can tell it, if you don't know something, tell me that you don't know. You can instruct it not to do things, but I don't think there's a 100% foolproof way. I would see if there's any custom versions of ChatGPT to see, like, if there's somebody who has really gotten into the back end to try to, like, narrow the breadth of responses it will give. But to my knowledge, there's no way to absolutely remove hallucinations, because hallucinations are kind of just another example of it being creative, and it doesn't know it shouldn't be that creative. Let's see. When we upload stuff to the LLM, do we consider it their property? Have we lost copyright? You should be able to read their policies and get an answer to that question. My understanding is that most of them say anything that you put into it and anything that you get out of it is your property. But again, the copyright question, that's a legal question that the courts have kind of said, it's your property, but it's not something where there's a copyright that you can protect. So if you publish something that came out of ChatGPT, if someone wants to rip you off, you have no protections against that because it's not really yours. But my understanding is most of the policies say that if you put data in there, it's still yours. But again, there are like security questions you might ask. There's a question about whether we're going to offer any webinars for genealogy research. It's definitely something that I'll consider. And I think especially as we continue to use these tools, there might be some really cool techniques, especially when you're dealing with like a lot of data. Like, let's say you have 15 different sources for the same person, how you can kind of sort through that data. I haven't played around with that a lot, but I think there's some kind of like data analysis possibilities that we could teach about. All right. I think that's all of the questions I see, and we have just a couple minutes left, so I'll hang out a couple more minutes. But I just really appreciate everybody joining us today. And there was also a question about a handout, because as you see, this was so general. I didn't create a handout because I didn't really want to recommend specific resources. Things are changing so quickly. There are resources out there if you want to continue to learn, but I felt like any information or any websites I pointed to, they're going to change in just a few months. Things are going to keep evolving. But yeah, the slides themselves will be on our YouTube page. Let's see. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And again, don't hesitate to reach out, and we're all just going to keep learning about this topic. This was a really great learning experience for me as well.